Welcome back to the Busy Executives Podcast. Today, my guest is Jimmy Soni. Jimmy, thank you so much for taking time and joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Jimmy wrote this book, and for those of you who are listening and can't see our video today, it's The Founders, and it's the story of PayPal and the entrepreneurs who really shaped Silicon Valley. I'm so excited to dive into this book, into your insights. We're going to talk about the leadership principles there, but you being an award-winning author, again, I thank you, for your time, but also I'm just excited to hear what you've pulled away from all your research around this as well.
Well, it was 6 years end to end, so it was a really long time. One of the board members, his joke was, "You spent longer working on the book about the creation of the company than I spent actually on the board of the company." Wow. And I was like, "That was good, nice one, John. That was solid." But I learned a lot, and I think for me it was. My other books are biographies. And so sometimes when I describe this book, I call it's like the biography of a company, right? Meaning it's not about one person, right? It's about 300, hundreds of people. And so that's kind of the background for people who might not have heard of it. It was an attempt to crystallize and to get people to be a fly on the wall for this really crazy time in Silicon Valley from 1998 to 2002. And, and it just happens that the people who were involved in the making of PayPal turned out to be, some people who are household names.
Right. Yeah. What, walk us back, for our listeners, what prompted you? Cause, you do these biographies, you've written some amazing books. What prompted you to take on the 6-year journey and write this story?
Yeah, and I just want to be clear. If I had known it had been 6 years, I'm not sure I would have done it. That wasn't deliberate. There wasn't a life plan to spend more than a half decade of my life thinking about Silicon Valley. I mean, lots of other things I could do that would be more fun. I'm only half kidding, but what happened is, and Michael, this will be appealing hopefully to you and to your listeners. I had written a biography of somebody named Claude Shannon, and he worked at a place called Bell Labs. And there are some listeners who might be familiar with Bell Labs, but for those who aren't, imagine the most innovative US company for many, many, many decades. And that's what Bell Labs was in the 20th century. It was the research arm, the R&D arm of Bell Telephone Company. So think like Google X, but way bigger, right? And imagine Google ran the phone system, so it had just endless piles of money, right? Bell Labs is this place that warehouses all these incredibly talented people, and they produce innovations that, honestly, you and I are using it right now. Satellite technology, all communications, everything communications network related, they built. The laser, touch tone dialing, they made improvements to the bazooka. They did all these things, and so you can't kind of look at Bell Labs and say, oh, it's all because of this one. It's all because of Joe Smith, this one person. It's actually this real constellation of people who come together. And I started to think that's kind of interesting. We have this version of events that we tell ourselves, right? It's one company, one person, Meta, Zuckerberg, Microsoft, Gates, et cetera, et cetera. But really, what's interesting are these clusters of talent. You sort of think about the 90s Bulls just aren't about Michael Jordan, right? There's a bunch of people who make these things successful. So I started to think about where those clusters were in technological history. And in tech history, there's a few of them. One kind of famous one is called Fairchild Semiconductor. Another one is called Xerox PARC. Everybody sort of knows Xerox, but this sort of research wing of that company was called Xerox PARC. And another group of people, a group, was what's known today as the PayPal Mafia, quote unquote. And that I kind of assumed, weirdly, I assumed that someone had, because of who they are, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, multiple billionaires, people who are involved in all walks of life, I assumed that somebody had written the book. So I went on Amazon and I typed in the phrase PayPal Mafia, and I didn't find anything. I kept looking, and there were little books, there were biographies of the individual people, or maybe there was a project or two here. There was a memoir written by somebody who worked there, but no writer who didn't work there had kind of gone back, interviewed everyone, and just tried to get to the bottom of wait, how is it that the people who invented YouTube, Yelp, Palantir, Tesla. How is it that all of
Mhm.
you ended up at one company? Like, this is insane, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it was a graduate school or like a college, parents would pay any amount of money to get their kids in. And so
Right.
that's what motivated me. I thought, it's not. I kind of had this sense, a hunch that that it wasn't an accident that all these people ended up at this company, and that what they learned at the company influenced all of this stuff that happened later. And
Mm.
so with that, I kind of started this journey of just daisy chaining introductions and trying to track people down and find people and just spend time talking to them about this thing that happened in their lives 20 years before I walked through their door.
Wow. That's awesome. So obviously, not only spending that time interviewing folks, but then as you kind of piece this narrative together, what were some of your biggest initial takeaways? What were some of your biggest ahas, or maybe things that you kind of said, gosh, I didn't really expect this to come out of this story that I'm writing?
It's a great question, and I'm going to try to keep my answer brief because I think I could just sort of go, without stopping for like 30
Sure.
minutes. I mean,
Sure.
I spent so much time trying to understand the story, so the insights kind of bubbled up at different moments. I would say let's take your question specifically, which is kind of at the beginning of the process or throughout like what were the surprising insights or things you discovered? I would say a few things. One, it was surprising to me how uncertain PayPal's success was. We take PayPal and a lot of these, frankly, this applies to a lot of digital technologies, but let's just focus on PayPal. We take a lot of it for granted, right? Like, it works, it's there, they own Venmo, that works. But in fact, like, making it work was super difficult. It was really complex intellectually. It was really complex technically. It was complex from a product market fit perspective. It was complex to get the team together to do it, right? So that was like one big surprise. In fact, like, one of the ways that I describe the book is this basically like a journey from failure to failure, right? Or near failure to near failure. So that was one thing. The second thing that surprised me is how much of an imprint this experience left on all of the people and all the lives like that I was touching with this research. Like, again and again, I would have the experience of somebody saying to me, I'll tell you one specific story. I was interviewing this person, and at the end of our interview, there was like a pause, and he says something like, "Whoa." And then he paused and he says, "Whoa, I just realized that basically my entire life, my friends, all the decisions I've made, all the work I've done can be traced back to this decision I made 20 years ago to join this company." And
Wow.
so it had this like profound butterfly effect in like these people's lives, right? And more than that, it actually taught them something. It set a standard for how they wanted to work. I had another gentleman I interviewed who said, what PayPal taught me is just to have like a very high standard for my team. Like, he's like, because what happened is I got there and everyone was so good that I just assumed that's how companies are, that everyone's just really good. And so he
Right.
said, Zona, took some learning for me to realize, like, no, that was a special place, and that what it taught me is to keep standards high. So I would say that was like another broad insight. I'll sort of do three because three is a good number and we can keep going. I would say it also taught me that sometimes you hear this line or this sort of thought about Silicon Valley that they don't like experience. They want like really, inexperienced people, like really passionate amateurs. And that's true. Like, that's definitely true. Like, one of the things that makes Silicon Valley amazing is that if you are somebody who has passion and you don't know anything, you can actually get very far. But a number of the people I interviewed provided evidence that was a little different. And what they were, I sort of describe them as like skeptical, experienced people, right? So like they are experienced for sure in the financial services industry, but they saw enough to be skeptical about it and to bring that skepticism to PayPal. So one example is this gentleman named Sanjay Bhargava. Sanjay had spent like 15, 20 years in banks and different institutions before he ever got interviewed by Elon for a job at PayPal. And it was overcoming that experience and like kind of having enough skepticism to say, hey, here's what I've seen that's not great, that allowed him to get a job when he was often in the room with people who didn't have any of his experience and were 20 years younger, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the argument really isn't about age. It's about having a certain approach to your job that says, how can I make things better? And then at some point, these experienced people would get frustrated because nobody wanted them to make things better. And then they would go off either on their own and do a startup, or they would come to a place like PayPal that embraced that kind of skepticism. So it was a really interesting way of thinking about it, because I think it's too easy to say like, oh, they just hired a bunch of 20-somethings and everything was successful and nobody knew anything. That's just not true, right? There were people on the team with graduate degrees. There were people on the team who had spent a lot of time in industry, but they came in with a healthy skepticism about what that industry could do.
Yeah. Wow. And, obviously the startup industry and, starting a brand new company, you have all these this cast of characters who have varied experiences, right? But coming together and creating a startup and then really kind of creating that culture, right? For what they want to be known for, you get the mafia reference and kind of how they formed this thing, not only just on the system side and practically, but really kind of how they wanted to function as a team. Maybe you could dive in a little bit about that piece as well.
Yeah, and I think there's an important disclaimer here that you'll hear from several of the people if you watch their interviews. Because remember, all the people I interviewed are living. Like, people who go on YouTube and watch their interviews are great. One of the things that is important to remember is that many of the people who founded this company, this was either their first serious effort, or they were sort of like, it was round number 2. They weren't, kind of wizened executive types. And so a lot of what you would describe as culture was somewhat accidental, right? There were some things that I'll get into that they did that were deliberate, but the place kind of developed organically. It wasn't like there was like a trust falls and like retreat, it wasn't that kind of place, because it was a startup. They were trying to move really fast. And remember, context is king. They're creating the company when the dot-com bubble is bursting. So there isn't a lot of time for discussions about culture. They just have to fight to survive, right? Which is actually like what becomes a big part of the culture, is just this fight for survival. So with all that said, there were a few things that were a little, let's call it quirky or a little different, right? One example is this story that I heard over and over again, which is the team basically abolished or outlawed meetings with more than like a set number of people, like 3 or 4 people. And if you tried to host a meeting that was very large, you kind of got this like nasty look from people. And that was really interesting. And one of the reasons why is because they had this idea, and I think this is proven true in different contexts, that meetings can just be gigantic wastes of time, that the loudest voice wins, that they're not especially productive, that we overdo the meeting thing, right? And so there's this great scene in the book where somebody hosts a meeting that's a little large, and David Sachs is glaring into the room, like sort of like burning a hole through the meeting, like, why is this happening, And so, but I think there's some truth to this idea that part of what PayPal did was that it didn't hire people to manage. It hired people to be great individual contributors and like sort of stumble into leadership if needed, right? And so everybody had a pretty tangible role, and not at every level, but at a lot of levels, especially early on. That's one. The second is there was a sense that you kind of had to step up your game, right? Here's what I mean by that. Like, I interviewed this person. This is actually not in the book, so this is stuff that's not in the book. But I interviewed this person, and his name was Ted Fong. And Ted said to me, he said, one of the things that happened at PayPal is that when I would like go to my boss, I think his boss was David Sachs at one point, he said, when I had to present something, just given how intense the place was, I didn't slack on my preparation for the presentation. He said, I was always a little bit afraid, like when I went into those meetings. He said, but it also jogged the best work that I could do out of me, right? So like you might contrast that, let's say, with an environment that on the surface is more supportive, like more like outwardly supportive, but where people don't actually like bring their A game, right? And I think there's like pros and cons to both. But one of the things about PayPal is that it was not a place where like there were my interviews with these people did not make it sound like it was the kind of place where there were a lot of pleasantries or pats on the back or any of that kind of stuff. There was a team dynamic, but the team was focused on survival and on making the company successful, not on being nice to each other. And sometimes that led to some real clashes, like interpersonal clashes between people. But the way I put it in the book is the disharmony led to discovery. Like people fighting against each other, like really arguing with each other, is what produced really great insights. And I think, there's a kind of critique of that, like that, maybe everybody doesn't feel like they can participate or whatever. But I will tell you, like, even the introverts that I interviewed, even the people who are maybe a little bit more kind of like quieter, maybe wallflowers, said that part of what that did is it encouraged the truth to bubble up, right? Like people fought for their ideas because they were fighting for the truth of what they believed. And it doesn't always work perfectly, but I did find that like there was this great line that Max Levchin is in a different interview that I put in the book. He said, at a later startup, we created a culture where everybody was just nice to each other. But then what happened is people started talking badly about each other behind their back. He said at PayPal, we at least would, if we were going to say something was dumb, we would just say it was dumb to the person's face. And we weren't attacking the person, we were attacking the idea. And I think that's a very fine line. It's a very hard thing to get right. But it's one of the things that's a part of the culture that I think is really important, is this commitment. It's almost like a rigorous commitment to the truth. Even if the person is momentarily offended by what you said, there's a kind of deeper commitment there to being right and being accurate, right? The last thing I'll say, and this is it's a little bit, it's become a kind of truism in startup life, but I think it's really important to emphasize, is there was a cultural encouragement of kind of flouting convention or of going against leadership. Meaning, I had this person I interviewed as a later co-founder of Yelp, Jeremy Stalpman. He said, I once sent an email where I just slammed this decision that an executive made. And he said, and I thought in other companies, maybe somebody would have taken me, taken me to task for that. At PayPal, he said they celebrated that. I had people I had people coming up and slapping me on the back, saying how great it was. And it was the kind of place where that sort of thing was allowed or even encouraged. The idea that if you saw that the emperor had no clothes, you said it. And again, super hard to get right, but it empowered even the most junior person, in the hierarchy to feel like they had ownership over the company. So there were people directly corresponding with the senior executives. And there was a sense that if you had something to say, or if you had something you were going to get done, it was you should just go do it. Just be entrepreneurial and do it. And there's no need to check in with 14 layers of management. I know this doesn't work in all organizations. There's certainly organizations that this wouldn't fly. But what I saw and the people I interviewed felt deeply empowered because they felt like they could actually speak up, and it was encouraged, not forbidden.
Right. Gosh, it's so good. And it's so true. I mean, especially with the organizations I work with, it's that authenticity, even if it, causes conflict, or even if there's, some struggles that kind of come from it, is so much more healthy than this fake environment that really doesn't support people or doesn't actually allow them to have a voice, right? Because you kind of have to toe the company line, or you have to, you're too afraid to say something that you shouldn't say. So it sounds like obviously for them, it helped foster that innovation, but also really helped them foster an environment where people could be more authentic. They could just be more themselves, or they could champion some of these ideas. So,
and by the way, I'll give you the best example, which has nothing to do with the company's success or failure. So at one point, they're in the midst of some cost cutting because, it's the dot-com bubble burst, the NASDAQ cratered by 80% in the year 2000. The company is on fumes and has to figure all these things out. And so there's this effort, I think it was in 2001, they're starting to prepare to go public. And so they start to want to trim costs because you want to show investors that you're taking that seriously. And they cut the free, it was free vending machine snacks or free food or something. There was some freebie of food that they decided they were going to do away with. And the employees are super mad about this. They're really, and what happens is they put in a thing where now you have to pay for those snacks. And so what the employee said is well, look, if we're going to pay for the snacks, we're going to launch a rebellion because these snacks suck. And so there was this one designer, George Ishii, who designs a system with his desk and a computer, and he would buy snacks, put them in the desk, and then created a system where if you bought them, you could scan he bought a scanner and you could scan your PayPal ID and it would debit your PayPal account for the payment for the snacks. And it was this he basically created a store within the company that was a rival to the vending machines that the company underwrote, right? And so it was this gigantic, it was this act of rebellion. And I wrote it up in the book, even though it's not related to the company's arc. it was just the perfect essence of this spirit of rebellion, of the idea that like
Mm.
our leaders said we need to cut costs and they're charging us for snacks. Well, screw them. We're gonna go do our own thing now.
That's so funny. Oh my gosh. That's awesome. That's a cool story. Well, I mean, snacks are important, right? So
Right.
obviously they found that out, but oh, yeah, that's great. So let's pivot a little bit. So, obviously talking about some of these household names, and someone like Elon Musk has obviously been in the news, over and over again. And you've been able to, see not only him, but, so many other great leaders. What are some of the things that you would feel like in the narrative that's out there, in regards to their personalities or leadership, or some of those things that as you walked through this and as you heard and kind of got this 360 view of PayPal, that are maybe some misconceptions out there, or maybe something where you would say, gosh, the narrative sounds like it's this for these folks, but this is actually what I heard from those who got to work with them the closest.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I would say like the misconceptions are everywhere. Because I mean, I did a pretty careful study of particularly of Elon and his role in the company, and then I spent time interviewing him and kind of. I mean, I read a lot of emails that he sent. I spoke to a lot of people that he worked with, and I would say here's the biggest one, and it's the one that's like hardest to fix, but it actually contributes to all the other misconceptions.
Mm.
I had a devil of a time getting people to talk to me. And even when I got them to talk to me, I had a hard time getting them to open up, because particularly if you're an engineer, I would say like on the skepticism scale, people in business development kind of understood what I was doing broadly. Right. But it took a while to convince or persuade people who are engineers, like, hey, here's why this book should be written and here's why you should talk to me, all that stuff. Now overlook, and I will say that most of them were very generous once they got the idea. But I think one of the things that happens in a lot of contemporary writing about, let's say, Elon, is that engineers don't talk to journalists, right?
Mm.
So you'll get somebody who kind of doesn't speak to the people who are closest to his work. And I had this awesome thing happen, which is a lot of the engineers that worked with him super closely said yes. So I just had a very different view into who he was, how he works, et cetera. And I'll point to a couple things that were important to the engineers I interviewed. Several of them said the following. They said, it is a blessing to have a boss who is technically proficient, because technical proficiency often doesn't happen in the CEO role. And
Right.
because he was technically proficient, and because he would sort of roll up his elbows and sit side by side with him and try to solve problems, it actually made a big difference. It was inspiring at a minimum, and at a maximum, it led to better products and services, right? And I think that people can like think that this is like a small thing, or that, oh, he's just a salesman, or, but actually, like, if you interview the coders that I interviewed, he was right there with them, and I think that's really important, and it's easily missed because, engineers, many of them don't necessarily want to talk to the press. I mean, nobody does, right? I would say the second thing that matters, I mean, from my perspective, that emerged from this story that really surprised me, and I didn't know this going in. I mean, I think I kind of knew it, but it didn't really click, is that in the 4 year period I'm writing about him, Elon almost dies because of malaria and meningitis. He almost dies in a car accident. He loses a child to SIDS, and he gets kicked out of the company PayPal that he helped to co-found. And so the idea that like his life has been sort of one unalloyed success following success, it's just not true. One of the interesting things about that 4 year stretch is like, I can't imagine ever getting up again and doing anything. If I had those four things happen, I would just retire. I mean, I don't know that for sure. I hope I wouldn't, but like, it's a pretty safe bet that I might. In the aftermath of those four things, he creates SpaceX, and he does it essentially from scratch. He buys the URL himself and just gets started, right?
Wow.
So I think people underestimate his endurance. I think a lot of the things that, like, people want to focus on what they want to focus on. You can't. It's one of these things. It's really hard to get at someone's character. And I think part of his character is this remarkable ability to come back from failure after failure after failure, both personal and professional. And I started to hear this from other people too. There was this engineer I interviewed, Doug Mack. There's a point in the story where Elon, the company is kind of split in two. These leaders try to remove him from the company. This is a very early story. And Doug stays with Elon. He had a choice. He could go with Team A or Team B, and Team B is Elon. And he goes with Elon. And I asked him, I said, look, you had a lot on the line. Elon's pretty young. He's like 27. Like, what made you want to stay? And he said, you just got the sense from Elon that he would spend his last dollar for this company to be successful. You could just see it. And he said, and that was like so, motivating for somebody like me. He's like, I was young too. I didn't have a lot to lose, but this guy seemed like he would spend his last dollar to make us successful. So I think that's some of the stuff that all the stuff, the media stuff doesn't necessarily capture, because it's hard to capture. And I think part of it is like, sometimes you can only capture it 20 years after something has happened. Right. But I will say those are the biggest observations that I had kind of doing this process.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. And so true. I mean, having a leader who will be in the trenches with you, if I'm hearing you right, and also cares, so much. And like you said, will put in their blood, sweat, and tears and money to make sure that it's successful. I mean, that obviously is going to endear folks a lot more, even if, personality wise, there's some quirks or some different things that way. And so, yeah, that's so good. I love your stories, Jimmy. As we're kind of wrapping up, what would you say are one or two things from the book? If a lot of our listeners are folks who are leading at that C-suite level, right? They're CEOs or executives, they're business owners. What are one or two things from this book specifically? Again, just to kind of highlight it here real fast, is The Founders. Great book. I've dove in just a bit and loved it so far. What are a couple of things that they could pull away that could help them become even better leaders as they hear this story, as they kind of walk through this beginning journey, and you get to kind of highlight everything through this PayPal journey?
It's a great question. And I think one of the things about books is, and I've learned this sort of in different ways, like readers will come to it with and draw from it their own lessons, right? So I want to be careful that I'm not putting the thumb on the scale too much. Like readers are going to find whatever story they're going to find, right? And so, but with that disclaimer, I would say kind of like two big things stand out for somebody who's running a contemporary company. One is there's a real premium at PayPal in these early years on giving younger employees and more junior employees a lot of rope. And I saw this again and again, like basically like there was one person, Peter Thiel, who embodies this. I had this experience where I would interview all these people and they all kind of said the same thing. And so then I wrote it up, right? And the thing they said that was kind of the same is they said, I wouldn't have placed the bet on me that Peter did. They said I was young, or I'd just been let go from a job, or I had this crazy thing happen in my life, or some chaos, whatever, blah, blah, all these things. And they said, but Peter took a chance on me. And because he took a chance on me, I felt committed to really succeed and over deliver. And I think one of the things that happens is it's really hard to do that. I mean, it's like, I'm not good at that, right? But because it requires a huge amount of trust. It requires a huge amount of the ability to even take a risk with something. And I think to the extent that somebody in the C-suite can give somebody that's clearly motivated a little bit more rope, or give someone a second chance, I think that's what that story reveals. And I'll tell you, the people that I interviewed were some of the people that were most successful in Silicon Valley today. So these are people who that quote unquote chance led to everything. But I still think somebody had to be there to give them that opportunity. So I would say that's kind of one thing is don't discount the potential of people who maybe are a little bit rough around the edges, because that's one of the great secrets, that's one of the great sort of reasons why this company was successful is you had all these people that were a little bit, some of them were misfits, oddballs, and they all had a lot of rope. That's one. The second is, the thing the tempo of product development and of creating things and of doing work at this company was lightning fast. It's one of the things that I think we really underestimate is just how fast startups have to move, because they're competing against incumbents, right? And so these incumbents have all kinds of advantages. And I had this amazing moment. So one of the things I did is I didn't just try to interview people at the very top. I also interviewed customer service agents, right? So there are hundreds of these people, and I would just find them, email them, see if they'd talk to me. And one of the customer service agents shared a story with me. She said, one of the things that we noticed, they were in Omaha, Nebraska. She said, one of the things that we noticed is that if we had a problem and we let Palo Alto, she calls it Palo Alto, the mothership, the headquarters. If we let headquarters in Palo Alto know, they would basically stay up all night and fix whatever was broken.
Hmm.
And that happened. She's like, that happens so often. Like we would call them at like 6 o'clock at night, and we would wake up the next morning and they would send an email saying, "Hey, this has been fixed. You're good." And it's one of these things that like I know that's very hard to get right in big organizations, and I know startups do it well and some do it badly, whatever. I think the point is speed matters and like tempo matters, right? And you can set a tempo as a leader. It's what Elon has called in different contexts like maniacal urgency, right?
Hmm.
But I saw it in different people, not just him. I saw it company wide, where there was a real sense that like it actually the pace of the pace of getting things done matters a great deal to your success. And that's something that I think big company or small, it's the kind of thing that could be encouraged.
Hmm. Yeah, gosh, such great insights. I feel like we could keep diving into these different areas, but so true, having kind of that maniacal urgency, or, I kind of call it radical urgency towards serving others. And then, like you said, just really making sure that people know what you're about, and have that vision, even if it's really intense, right? Or even if it's really kind of calling people up, above and beyond what they even think they're capable of, which obviously a lot of the leaders and just really, again, the team was able to do. So love it so much, Jimmy. So for folks who would love to learn more about, number one, your book, some of your work, I know you speak, there's lots of different opportunities to connect with you. Where are some of the best places for them to find you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter and I'm on LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm Jimmy A. Soni. And on LinkedIn, I'm just Jimmy Soni. You can find me there and connect with me. And then my website is just jimmysoni.com. And I have all my contact info and whatnot there. And I love hearing from readers. I do a lot of speaking. I do a lot of different things for groups and companies. And so I'd be happy to do that. And then obviously just to be in touch with people who are reading the book. And again, like sharing what they learned from it. Like, it's more interesting to me to see what readers take from it than what I took from it in some ways.
Sure.
And so I appreciate the chance to connect with readers.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jimmy. Appreciate your time and your insights. I love the work that you've done. And just thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.